I'm Patricia Cortes, and I'm Associate Professor of Markets, Public Policy, and Law. I'm a labor economist who specializes in inequalities in the labor market, particularly gender inequalities. So my research finds that the gender gap, although it has narrowed over time, has proved very consistent. And this is particularly true for the high skilled, those with at least a college degree. Now, when we look at the gender gap over the lifetime, and I'm just going to focus mostly on the high skilled, what you observe is that the gender gap is the narrowest at the beginning of the career. And it widens, especially when it's the time that women start having children. And what the literature has found, including my work, is that the main reason why we observe this gap is actually what we call the child penalty. And the child penalty is kind of the effects of having a child on the careers of women. Now, there's also a gender gap, as I said before, at the beginning of careers. And actually, another research that I have that is using data from Question undergrads, in which we are comparing the initial salaries of men and women graduating from Question, having taken the same courses, being in the same universities, we still observe the gender gap. And the gender gap is not solely explained by like different industries or different concentration. Even when you compare men and women with the same concentration, you will find that women earn lower wages. Now, a potential explanation for that gap at the beginning of careers, that as I said before, is much smaller than it would be later in life, but still there, is gender difference in some what I call psychological attributes. So things like risk aversion, of overconfidence. And in one of my papers, we actually show that the fact that women are more risk averse, for example, led them to sometimes accept a job that don't offer that much, but that gives them the peace of mind that they have a job. But those things compared to the child penalty later in life are relatively small. So yes, we see a lot of variation across occupation in the gender gap. And I'm going to focus on those with at least a college degree. So on one end of the spectrum, you will find industries or occupations that sound familiar to our audience, that is basically the corporate sector or business occupations. Also actually law, so lawyers. In these occupations is where you're going to see the largest gender gap. On the other hand, you will see smaller gender gaps in occupations such as veterinarians or pharmacists. And we want to understand why is that in corporate and law, we find these very large gender gaps, and in other occupations, we find smaller gender gaps. And a reason that has been proposed, and I have looked in my research, is that the occupations in which we see the largest gender gaps is those occupations that reward people working very, very long hours. And because women tend to be less flexible, because on average, they work more at home. They're the ones responsible for children. In some occupations, they don't want to offer, or they cannot offer to work the long hours that it requires to be really successful in those occupations. So when you think, for example, about law and becoming a partner in a law firm, the only option is working 80 hours a week. There's just no other option. If you don't work the 80 hours a week, right, and you work 40, you're not going to make partner. And if you don't make partner, you're not going to make the very, very high wages. So what is your option? Your option is being a family lawyer. And family lawyer, if they work 40 hours, they would make less than half than being a partner in a law firm. Okay, so it tends to be those occupations in which working long hours is highly rewarded. And that's also going to be true for the corporate sector. So unless in some industries such as, consulting, unless you're willing to work the very, very long hours, you're not going to make it. And there is where we see the largest gender gap. On the other hand, we have other occupations in which is kind of more linear. So if you work more hours, of course, you will earn more, but you will not earn disproportionately more, right? If you work 20 hours instead of 40 hours, you earn half, okay? So things like pharmacy is one in which has been proven to be very linear, right? My hourly wage or how much I get per hour does not depend a lot in how many hours I work. So, I mean, it has narrowed when we compare it to the gender gap back in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. It has definitely narrowed. A large part of when we look at the raw gender gap, a main explanation of why it has narrowed over time is gender convergence in education, because nowadays, back in the 60s or 70s, actually women were less likely to go to college. Now they're even more likely than men to go to college. So of course that has increased their relative earnings. So one explanation is the increase in human capital for women. The other one is also that women have started to enter occupations that are highly paid. Okay, so back in the 50s or 60s, even 70s, most women will be nurses or teachers. But nowadays, we see as many women in law school, or even more women in law school than men, same in medical school, right? So we have seen a convergence. But as I said before, a real puzzle is why even if women have made these great advances, in some occupations, we still see this gender gap that has been proving very, very persistent. It's a difficult question because, I mean, there's some things that companies can do, right? So people think about providing maternity leave. And probably providing maternity leave, what it would do is to make more likely that a mother returns to work, right? But it's not going to fix the problem of these high-powered occupations in which you really need to work these long hours. And sometimes it depends on the occupation, but sometimes the reason why people have to work very long hours is because there's little substitutability between workers. So when you think, for example, of law, right? One of the reasons why it's difficult or why many hours are required or a lot of flexibility is required is because lawyers work with clients. So a lawyer gets to know a client, gets to work to the client trusts the lawyer, and the client just wants to interact with this particular lawyer, right? So in that sense, it's very difficult, right, to restrict the number of hours because it's not, okay, I cannot talk to you right now. I'm going to send the other lawyer who doesn't know the case, who doesn't have the trust, etc. So there are occupations in which it's very difficult to substitute a worker for another. And there's something about the occupations that make it work like that are difficult to change. That said, it's not impossible. So to give you a nice example of how change within the occupation has allowed women to do better in the occupation is the case of you're pregnant and you have your doctor, and the doctor is going to see you every time, and the doctor is going to deliver your baby. And if it's Sunday, 2 a.m., the doctor is going to be there in the hospital to help deliver your baby, okay? Now, that was not the case when I have my kid here in the US, because now they have reorganized how work is organized such that they have something like a practice, right? So what's the difference with a practice? With a practice, right, I was usually seen by my same doctor, but I knew that the delivery was not necessarily going to be my doctor, that they have set a schedule such that the doctor knew that a doctor knew when he or she is going to be in this particular weekend in the hospital, right? And I will have my baby with that doctor, right? But that gives much more flexibility to the doctor, right? The doctor doesn't have to run every time somebody calls them, and doesn't have to work these very long hours. The system is structured such that it allows for people in that occupation to have much more flexibility. And that has allowed women to flourish in those occupations. Now, it's a little bit the egg and the chicken, right? And I mean, I'm not an expert in this particular occupation, but one doesn't know if the fact that it got to restructure in a way that worked for women is because there were women entering the occupation, or there was something that changed within the occupation that allowed for more women to come. There's this change within occupations that can happen that facilitate women doing well in the occupations, okay? Now, a policy that actually has shown some effects, which is interesting, is actually paternity leave. And why paternity leave? Because the reason why women have this higher cost of providing these long hours at work is because even if both the mother and the father work full time, because of, call it gender norms, on average, it's still the case that the woman is the one who provides most of the childcare. And that's why she has a harder time providing the long hours. So one potential solution is actually to change the distribution of work within the household such that it's more equal, right? And that's difficult to change, right? Because these are gender norms of generations of mothers. Of course, we come some way and we see stay-home dads and dads being more involved and stuff, but it's still the case when you look at the numbers that even if both father and mother work full-time, it's usually the woman who is in charge, mostly in charge of the childcare. So what paternity leave does is that it kind of forces at the very start of the kid's life, not forces, but allows, to some bonding between the father and the baby, and the father to get to know, how to take care of a baby, or how difficult it is and how much work it is, and potentially down the road allow for a more equal distribution of household work within the household. So it has been shown that it has changed a little bit the distribution of household work within the household when a man has paternity leave. In some countries, like Scandinavian countries, that I have this daddy leave, and basically they give them 3 months and they take it or leave it. They cannot, give it to the mother or do something. They are forced to take it. Not forced, they can take it or not take it, but it's a relatively long leave that has allowed for fathers to, take 3 months out of their job and take care of the kids. Another thing that I think might help over the longer run, and might be a silver lining of the pandemic, is that working from home became much more common and accepted. So before, working from home was sometimes an option, but a costly option. And a costly option in terms of being involved in the office, a costly option on the kind of stigma or mommy track that, if you're saying that you want to work from from your home, is that you're not as committed to your job, etc. And usually it was the mothers who want to do that, and they're not given good opportunities because they signaled that their family was first and they wanted to work from home. And I think this whole change of shift towards allowing to work from home more, right? And also men demanding or hoping to work more from home might actually change a little bit this dynamic and change kind of that cost of flexibility that before was a high cost.